This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gods of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior.
Chapter 15. Flight and Pursuit. I could not have been unconscious more than a few seconds, and yet I know that I was unconscious, for the next thing I realized was that a growing radiance was illuminating the corridor about me, and the eyes were gone. I was unharmed, except for a slight bruise upon my forehead where it had struck the stone flagging as I fell. I sprang to my feet to ascertain the cause of the light. It came from a torch in the hand of one of a party of 4 green warriors who were coming rapidly down the corridor toward me. They had not yet seen me, and so I lost no time in slipping into the first intersecting corridor that I could find. This time, however, I did not advance so far away from the main corridor as on the other occasion that had resulted in my losing Tarkis and his guards. The party came rapidly toward the opening of the passageway in which I crouched against the wall. As they passed by, I breathed a sigh of relief. I had not been discovered, and, best of all, the party was the same that I had followed into the pits. It consisted of Tarkis and his 3 guards. I fell in behind them, and soon we were at the cell in which the great Thark had been chained. 2 of the warriors remained without, while the man with the keys entered with the Thark to fasten his irons upon him once more. The 2 outside started to stroll slowly in the direction of the spiral runway which led to the floors above, and in a moment were lost to view beyond a turn in the corridor. The torch had been stuck in a socket beside the door, so that its rays illuminated both the corridor and the cell at the same time. As I saw the 2 warriors disappear, I approached the entrance to the cell with a well-defined plan already formulated. While I disliked the thought of carrying out the thing that I had decided upon, there seemed no alternative if Tarkis and I were to go back together to my little camp in the hills. Keeping near the wall, I came quite close to the door to Tarkis's cell, and there I stood with my longsword above my head, grasped with both hands, that I might bring it down in one quick cut upon the skull of the jailer as he emerged. I disliked to dwell upon what followed after I heard the footsteps of the man as he approached the doorway. It is enough that within another minute or two Tarkis, wearing the medal of a Warhoon chief, was hurrying down the corridor toward the spiral runway, bearing the Warhoon's torch to light his way. A dozen paces behind him followed John Carter, Prince of Helium. The 2 companions of the man who lay now beside the door of the cell that had been Tarkis's had just started to ascend the runway as the Thark came in view. "Why so long, Tangama?" cried one of the men. "I had trouble with a lock," replied Tarkis, "and now I find that I have left my short sword in the Thark's cell. Go you on. I'll return and fetch it." "As you will, Tangama," replied he who had before spoken. "We shall see you above directly." "Yes," replied Tarkis, and turned as though to retrace his steps to the cell. But he only waited until the 2 had disappeared at the floor above. Then I joined him. We extinguished the torch, and together we crept toward the spiral incline that led to the upper floors of the building. At the first floor we found that the hallway ran but halfway through, necessitating the crossing of a rear room full of green folk, ere we could reach the inner courtyard. So there was but one thing left for us to do, and that was to gain the second floor and the hallway through which I had traversed the length of the building. Cautiously we ascended. We could hear the sounds of conversation coming from the room above, but the hall still was unlighted, nor was anyone in sight as we gained the top of the runway. Together we threaded the long hall and reached the balcony overlooking the courtyard without being detected. At our right was the window letting into the room in which I had seen Tangama and the other warriors as they started to Tarkis's cell earlier in the evening. His companions had returned here, and we now overheard a portion of their conversation. "What can be detaining Tangama?" asked one. "He certainly could not be all this time fetching his short sword from the Thark's cell," spoke another. "His short sword?" asked a woman. "What mean you?" "Tangama left his short sword in the Thark's cell," explained the first speaker, "and left us at the runway to return and get it." "Tangama wore no short sword this night," said the woman. "It was broken in today's battle with the Thark, and Tangama gave it to me to repair. See, I have it here." And as she spoke she drew Tangama's short sword from beneath her sleeping silks and furs. The warriors sprang to their feet. "There is something amiss here," cried one. "'Tis even what I myself thought when Tangama left us at the runway," said another. "Methought then that his voice sounded strangely. Come, let us hasten to the pits." We waited to hear no more. Slinging my harness into a long single strap, I lowered Tarkis to the courtyard beneath, and an instant later dropped to his side. We had spoken scarcely a dozen words since I had felled Tangama at the cell door and seen in the torch's light the expression of utter bewilderment upon the great Thark's face. "By this time," he had said, "I should have learned to wonder at nothing which John Carter accomplishes." That was all. He did not need to tell me that he appreciated the friendship which had prompted me to risk my life to rescue him, nor did he need to say that he was glad to see me. This fierce green warrior had been the first to greet me that day, now 20 years gone, which had witnessed my first advent upon Mars. He had met me with levelled spear and cruel hatred in his heart, as he charged down upon me, bending low at the side of his mighty thwart, as I stood beside the incubator of his horde upon the Dead Sea bottom beyond Korab. And now among the inhabitants of two worlds I counted none a better friend than Tarkis, Jeddak of Tharks. As we reached the courtyard, we stood in the shadows beneath the balcony for a moment to discuss our plans. "There be 5 now in the party, Tarkis," I said. "Thuvia, Xodar, Carthoris, and ourselves. We shall need 5 thwarts to bear us." "Carthoris!" he cried. "Your son?" "Yes, I found him in the prison of Xodar on the Sea of Omin, in the land of the firstborn." "I know not any of these places, John Carter. Be they upon Barsoom?" "Upon and below, my friend. But wait until we shall have made good our escape, and you shall hear the strangest narrative that ever a Barsoomian of the outer world gave ear to. Now we must steal our thwarts and be well away to the north before these fellows discover how we have tricked them." In safety we reached the great gates at the far end of the courtyard, through which it was necessary to take our thwarts to the avenue beyond. It is no easy matter to handle 5 of these great fierce beasts, which by nature are as wild and ferocious as their masters, and held in subjection by cruelty and brute force alone. As we approached them they sniffed our unfamiliar scent, and with squeals of rage circled about us. Their long, massive necks upreared raised their great gaping mouths high above our heads. They are fearsome appearing brutes at best, but when they are aroused they are fully as dangerous as they look. The thoat stands a good 10 feet at the shoulder. His hide is sleek and hairless, and of a dark slate color on back and sides, shading down his 8 legs to a vivid yellow at the huge, padded, nailless feet. The belly is pure white. A broad, flat tail, larger at the tip than at the root, completes the picture of this ferocious green Martian mount, a fit war steed for these warlike people. As the thwarts are guided by telepathic means alone, there is no need for rein or bridle, and so our object now was to find 2 that would obey our unspoken commands. As they charged about us, we succeeded in mastering them sufficiently to prevent any concerted attack upon us, but the din of their squealing was certain to bring investigating warriors into the courtyard were it to continue much longer. At length I was successful in reaching the side of one great brute, and ere he knew what I was about I was firmly seated astride his glossy back. A moment later Tarkis had caught and mounted another. Then between us we herded 3 or 4 more toward the great gates. Tarkis rode ahead, and leaning down to the latch threw the barriers open, while I held the loose thoats from breaking back to the herd. Then together we rode through the avenues with our stolen mounts, and, without waiting to close the gates, hurried off toward the southern boundary of the city. Thus far our escape had been little short of marvelous, nor did our good fortune desert us, for we passed the outer purlieus of the dead city and came to our camp without hearing even the faintest sound of pursuit. Here a low whistle, the prearranged signal, appraised the balance of our party that I was returning, and we were met by the 3 with every manifestation of enthusiastic rejoicing. But little time was wasted in narration of our adventure. Tarkis and Carthoris exchanged the dignified and formal greetings common upon Barsoom, but I could tell intuitively that Thark loved my boy, and that Carthoris reciprocated his affection. Xodar and the green Jeddak were formally presented to each other. Then Thuvia was lifted to the least fractious thwart. Xodar and Carthoris mounted 2 others, and we set out at a rapid pace toward the east. At the far extremity of the city we circled toward the north, and under the glorious rays of the 2 moons we sped noiselessly across the Dead Sea bottom, away from the Warhoons and the firstborn, but to what new dangers and adventures we knew not. Toward noon of the following day we halted to rest our mounts and ourselves. The beasts were hobbled, that they might move slowly about, cropping the ochre moss-like vegetation which constitutes both food and drink for them on the march. Thuvia volunteered to remain on watch while the balance of the party slept for an hour. It seemed to me that I had but closed my eyes when I felt her hand upon my shoulder, and heard her soft voice warning me of a new danger. "Arise, O Prince," she whispered. "There be that behind us which has the appearance of a great body of pursuers." The girl stood pointing in the direction from whence we had come, and as I arose and looked, I too thought that I could detect a thin dark line on the far horizon. I awoke the others. Tarkus, whose giant stature towered high above the rest of us, could see the farthest. "It is a great body of mounted men," he said, "and they are traveling at high speed." There was no time to be lost. We sprang to our hobbled thoats, freed them, and mounted. Then we turned our faces once more toward the north, and took our flight again at the highest speed of our slowest beast. For the balance of the day and all the following night we raced across the ochre wilderness, with the pursuers at our back ever gaining upon us. Slowly but surely they were lessening the distance between us. Just before dark they had been close enough for us to plainly distinguish that they were green Martians, and all during the long night we distinctly heard the clanking of their accoutrements behind us. As the sun rose on the second day of our flight, it disclosed the pursuing horde not a half-mile in our rear. As they saw us, a fiendish shout of triumph rose from their ranks. Several miles in advance lay a range of hills, the further shore of the Dead Sea we had been crossing. Could we but reach these hills, our chances of escape would be greatly enhanced, but Thuvia's mount, although carrying the lightest burden, already was showing signs of exhaustion. I was riding beside her when suddenly her animal staggered and lurched against mine. I saw that he was going down, but ere he fell I snatched the girl from his back and swung her to a place upon my own thoat, behind me, where she clung with her arms about me. This double burden soon proved too much for my already overtaxed beast, and thus our speed was terribly diminished, for the others would proceed no faster than the slowest of us could go. In that little party there was not one who would desert another, yet we were of different countries, different colors, different races, different religions, and one of us was of a different world. We were quite close to the hills, but the Warhoons were gaining so rapidly that we had given up all hope of reaching them in time. Thuvia and I were in the rear, for our beast was lagging more and more. Suddenly I felt the girl's warm lips press a kiss upon my shoulder. "For thy sake, O my prince," she murmured. Then her arms slipped from about my waist, and she was gone. I turned and saw that she had deliberately slipped to the ground in the very path of the cruel demons who pursued us, thinking that by lightening the burden of my mount it might thus be enabled to bear me to the safety of the hills. Poor child! She should have known John Carter better than that. Turning my thoat, I urged him after her, hoping to reach her side and bear her on again in our hopeless flight. Carthoris must have glanced behind him at about the same time and taken in the situation, for by the time I had reached Thuvia's side he was there also, and springing from his mount he threw her upon its back, and turning the animal's head toward the hills, gave the beast a sharp crack across the rump with the flat of his sword. Then he attempted to do the same with mine. The brave boy's act of chivalrous self-sacrifice filled me with pride, nor did I care that it had wrested from us our last frail chance for escape. The Warhoons were now close upon us. Tarkus and Xodar had discovered our absence and were charging rapidly to our support. Everything pointed toward a splendid ending of my second journey to Barsoom. I hated to go out without having seen my divine princess, and held her in my arms once again. But if it were not writ upon the book of fate that such was to be, then would I take the most that was coming to me, and in these last few moments that were to be vouchsafed me before I passed over into that unguessed future, I could at least give such an account of myself in my chosen vocation as would leave the Warhoons of the South food for discourse for the next 20 generations. As Carthoris was not mounted, I slipped from the back of my own mount and took my place at his side to meet the charge of the howling devils bearing down upon us. A moment later Tarkus and Xodar ranged themselves on either hand, turning their thoats loose that we might all be on equal footing. The Warhoons were perhaps 100 yards from us when a loud explosion sounded from above and behind us, and almost at the same instant a shell burst in their advancing ranks. At once all was confusion. 100 warriors toppled to the ground. Riderless thoats plunged hither and thither among the dead and dying. Dismounted warriors were trampled underfoot in the stampede which followed. All semblance of order had left the ranks of the green men, and as they looked far above our heads to trace the origin of this unexpected attack, disorder turned to retreat, and retreat to a wild panic. In another moment they were racing as madly away from us as they had before been charging down upon us. We turned to look in the direction from whence the first report had come, and there we saw, just clearing the tops of the nearer hills, a great battleship swinging majestically through the air. Her bow gun spoke again even as we looked, and another shell burst among the fleeing war-hoons. As she drew nearer I could not repress a wild cry of elation, for upon her bows I saw the device of helium. End of chapter 15.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gods of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior.
Chapter 16. Under Arrest. As Carthoris, Xodar, Tartarchus, and I stood gazing at the magnificent vessel which meant so much to all of us, we saw a second and then a third top the summit of the hills and glide gracefully after their sister. Now a score of one-man air scouts were launching from the upper decks of the nearer vessel, and in a moment more were speeding in long swift dives to the ground about us. In another instant we were surrounded by armed sailors, and an officer had stepped forward to address us, when his eyes fell upon Carthoris. With an exclamation of surprised pleasure he sprang forward, and placing his hands upon the boy's shoulder, called him by name. "Carthoris, my prince!" he cried. "Caor, Caor! Horvastus greets the son of Dejah Thoris, princess of Helium, and of her husband John Carter. Where have you been, O my prince? All Helium has plunged in sorrow. Terrible have been the calamities that have befallen your great-grandsire's mighty nation since the fatal day that saw you leave our midst." "Grieve not, my good Horvastus," cried Carthoris, "since I bring not back myself alone to cheer my mother's heart and the hearts of my beloved people, but also one whom all Barsoom loved best, her greatest warrior and her savior, John Carter, Prince of Helium." Horvastus turned in the direction indicated by Carthoris, and as his eyes fell upon me he was like to have collapsed from sheer surprise. "John Carter!" he exclaimed, and then a sudden troubled look came into his eyes. "My prince," he started, "where hast thou—" And then he stopped, but I knew the question that his lips dared not frame. The loyal fellow would not be the one to force from mine a confession of the terrible truth that I had returned from the bosom of the Ish, the river of mystery, back from the shore of the lost sea of Chorus and the valley Dor. "Ah, my prince," he continued, as though no thought had interrupted his greeting, "that you are back is sufficient, and let Horvastus' sword have the high honor of being first at thy feet." With these words the noble fellow unbuckled his scabbard and flung his sword upon the ground before me. Could you know the customs and the character of red Martians, you would appreciate the depth of meaning that simple act conveyed to me and to all about us who witnessed it. The thing was equivalent to saying, "My sword, my body, my life, my soul are yours to do with as you wish. Until death and after death I look to you alone for authority for my every act. Be you right or wrong, your word shall be my only truth. Whoso raises his hand against you must answer to my sword." It is the oath of fealty that men occasionally pay to a Jeddak whose high character and chivalrous acts have inspired the enthusiastic love of his followers. Never had I known this high tribute paid to a lesser mortal. There was but one response possible. I stooped and lifted the sword from the ground, raised the hilt to my lips, and then, stepping to Horvastus, I buckled the weapon upon him with my own hands. "Horvastus," I said, placing my hand upon his shoulder, "you know best the promptings of your own heart. That I shall need your sword I have little doubt, but accept from John Carter upon his sacred honor the assurance that he will never call upon you to draw the sword other than in the cause of truth, justice, and righteousness." "That I knew, my prince," he replied, "ere ever I threw my beloved blade at thy feet." As we spoke, other fliers came and went between the ground and the battleship, and presently a larger boat was launched from above, one capable of carrying a dozen persons perhaps, and dropped lightly near us. As she touched, an officer sprang from her deck to the ground, and advancing to Horvastus saluted. "Cantos Can desires that this party whom we have rescued be brought immediately to the deck of the Xaverian," he said. As we approached the little craft, I looked about for the members of my party, and for the first time noticed that Thuvia was not among them. Questioning elicited the fact that none had seen her since Carthoris had sent her thoat galloping madly toward the hills, in the hope of carrying her out of harm's way. Immediately Horvastus dispatched a dozen air scouts in as many directions to search for her. It could not be possible that she had gone far since we had last seen her. We others stepped to the deck of the craft that had been sent to fetch us, and a moment later we were upon the Xodarian. The first man to greet me was Cantos Can himself. My old friend had won to the highest place in the navy of Helium, but he was still to me the same brave comrade who had shared with me the privations of a war-hewn dungeon, the terrible atrocities of the great games, and later the dangers of our search for Xodar within the hostile city of Zodanga. Then I had been an unknown wanderer upon a strange planet, and he a simple padwar in the navy of Helium. Today he commanded all Helium's great terrors of the skies, and I was a prince of the house of Tardos Mors, Jeddak of Helium. He did not ask me where I had been. Like Horvastus, he too dreaded the truth, and would not be the one to wrest a statement from me. That it must come sometime he well knew, but until it came he seemed satisfied to but know that I was with him once more. He greeted Carthoris and Tartarchus with the keenest delight, but he asked neither where he had been. He could scarcely keep his hands off the boy. "You do not know, John Carter," he said to me, "how we of Helium love this son of yours. It is as though all the great love we bore his noble father and his poor mother had been centered in him. When it became known that he was lost, 10 million people wept." "What mean you, Cantos Can?" I whispered. "By his poor mother." For the words had seemed to carry a sinister meaning which I could not fathom. He drew me to one side. "For a year," he said, "ever since Carthoris disappeared, Xodar has grieved and mourned for her lost boy. The blow of years ago, when you did not return from the atmosphere plant, was lessened to some extent by the duties of motherhood, for your son broke his white shell that very night. That she suffered terribly then all Helium knew, for did not all Helium suffer with her the loss of her lord? But with the boy gone there was nothing left, and after expedition upon expedition returned with the same hopeless tale of no clue as to his whereabouts, our beloved princess drooped lower and lower, until all who saw her felt that it could be but a matter of days ere she went to join her loved ones within the precincts of the valley door. As a last resort, Mors Kajak, her father, and Tardos Mors, her grandfather, took command of 2 mighty expeditions, and a month ago sailed away to explore every inch of ground in the northern hemisphere of Barsoom. For 2 weeks no word has come back from them, but rumors were rife that they had met with a terrible disaster, and that all were dead. About this time Xodar renewed his importunities for her hand in marriage. He has been for ever after her since you disappeared. She hated him and feared him, but with both her father and grandfather gone, Xodar was very powerful, for he is still Jed of Zodanga, to which position, you will remember, Tardos Mors appointed him, after you had refused the honor. He had a secret audience with her 6 days ago. What took place none knows, but the next day Xodar had disappeared, and with her had gone a dozen of her household guard and body servants, including Sola the Green Woman, Tartarchus's daughter, you recall. No word left they of their intentions, but it is always thus with those who go upon the voluntary pilgrimage from which none returns. We cannot think aught than that Xodar has sought the icy bosom of Ish, and that her devoted servants have chosen to accompany her. Xodar was at Helium when she disappeared. He commands this fleet which has been searching for her since. No trace of her have we found, and I fear that it be a futile quest." While we talked, Horvastus's fliers were returning to the Xodarian. Not one, however, had discovered a trace of Thuvia. I was much depressed over the news of Xodar disappearance, and now there was added the further burden of apprehension concerning the fate of this girl, whom I believed to be the daughter of some proud Barsoomian house, and it had been my intention to make every effort to return her to her people. I was about to ask Cantos Can to prosecute a further search for her, when a flier from the flagship of the fleet arrived at the Xodarian with an officer bearing a message to Cantos Can from Aris. My friend read the dispatch and then turned to me. "Xodar commands me to bring our prisoners before him. There is naught else to do. He is supreme in Helium. Yet it would be far more in keeping with chivalry and good taste were he to come hither and greet the saviour of Barsoom with the honours that are his due." "You know full well, my friend," I said, smiling, "that Xodar has good cause to hate me. Nothing would please him better than to humiliate me and then to kill me. Now that he has so excellent an excuse, let us go and see if he has the courage to take advantage of it." Summoning Carthoris, Tartarchus, and Xodar, we entered the small flier with Cantos Can and Xodar's officer, and in a moment we were stepping to the deck of Xodar's flagship. As we approached the Jed of Zodanga, no sign of greeting or recognition crossed his face. Not even to Carthoris did he vouchsafe a friendly word. His attitude was cold, haughty, and uncompromising. "Kaor, Xodar," I said in greeting, but he did not respond. "Why were these prisoners not disarmed?" he asked to Cantos Can. "They are not prisoners, Xodar," replied the officer. "Two of them are of Helium's noblest family. Tartarchus, Jeddak of Thark, is Tardos Mors' best beloved ally. The other is a friend and companion of the Prince of Helium. That is enough for me to know." "It is not enough for me, however," retorted Xodar. "More must I hear from those who have taken the pilgrimage than their names. Where have you been, John Carter?" "I have just come from the Valley Dor and the land of the firstborn, Xodar," I replied. "Ah!" he exclaimed in evident pleasure. "You do not deny it, then? You have returned from the bosom of Ish." "I have come back from a land of false hope, from a valley of torture and death. With my companions I have escaped from the hideous clutches of lying fiends. I have come back to the Barsoom that I saved from a painless death to again save her, but this time from death in its most frightful form." "Cease, blasphemer!" cried Xodar. "Hope not to save thy cowardly carcass by inventing horrid lies to—" But he got no further. One does not call John Carter coward and liar thus lightly, and Xodar should have known it. Before a hand could be raised to stop me, I was at his side, and one hand grasped his throat. "Come I from heaven or hell, Xodar, you will find me still the same John Carter that I've always been, nor did ever man call me such names and live without apologizing." And with that I commenced to bend him back across my knee and tighten my grip upon his throat. "Seize him!" cried Xodar, and a dozen officers sprang forward to assist him. Cantos Can came close and whispered to me, "Desist, I beg of you. It will but involve us all, for I cannot see these men lay hands upon you without aiding you. My officers and men will join me, and we shall have a mutiny then, that may lead to the revolution. For the sake of Tardos Mors and Helium, desist." At his words I released Xodar, and turning my back upon him, walked toward the ship's rail. "Come, Cantos Can," I said. "The Prince of Helium would return to the XVI." None interfered. Xodar stood white and trembling amidst his officers. Some there were who looked upon him with scorn and drew toward me, while one, a man long in the service and confidence of Tardos Mors, spoke to me in a low tone as I passed him. "You may count my medal among your fighting men, John Carter," he said. I thanked him and passed on. In silence we embarked, and shortly after stepped once more upon the deck of the XVI. 15 minutes later we received orders from the flagship to proceed toward Helium. Our journey thither was uneventful. Carthoris and I were wrapped in the gloomiest of thoughts. Cantos Can was somber in contemplation of the further calamity that might fall upon Helium should Xodar attempt to follow the age-old precedent that allotted a terrible death to fugitives from the Valley Dor. Tartarchus grieved for the loss of his daughter. Xodar alone was carefree, a fugitive and outlaw. He could be no worse off in Helium than elsewhere. "Let us hope that we may at least go out with good red blood upon our blades," he said. It was a simple wish, and one most likely to be gratified. Among the officers of XVI I thought I could discern division into fractions ere we had reached Helium. There were those who gathered about Carthoris and myself whenever the opportunity presented, while about an equal number held aloof from us. They offered us only the most courteous treatment, but were evidently bound by their superstitious belief in the doctrine of Dor and Ish and Chorus. I could not blame them, for I knew how strong a hold a creed, however ridiculous it may be, may gain upon an otherwise intelligent people. By returning from Dor we had committed a sacrilege. By recounting our adventures there, and stating the facts as they existed, we had outraged the religion of their fathers. We were blasphemers, lying heretics. Even those who still clung to us from personal love and loyalty, I think, did so in the face of the fact that at heart they questioned our veracity. It is very hard to accept a new religion for an old, no matter how alluring the promises of the new may be. But to reject the old as a tissue of falsehoods without being offered anything in its stead is indeed a most difficult thing to ask of any people. Cantos Can would not talk of our experiences among the Therns and the Firstborn. It is enough, he said, that I jeopardize my life here and hereafter by countenancing you all. Do not ask me to add still further to my sins by listening to what I've always been taught was the rankest heresy. I knew that sooner or later the time must come when our friends and enemies would be forced to declare themselves openly. When we reached Helium there must be an accounting, and if Tardos Mors had not returned I feared that the enmity of Xodar might weigh heavily against us, for he represented the government of Helium. To take sides against him were equivalent to treason. The majority of the troops would doubtless follow the lead of their officers, and I knew that many of the highest and most powerful men of both land and air forces would cleave to John Carter in the face of God, man, or devil. On the other hand, the majority of the populace unquestionably would demand that we pay the penalty of our sacrilege. The outlook seemed dark from whatever angle I viewed it. But my mind was so torn with anguish at the thought of Dejah Thoris that I realized now that I gave the terrible question of Helium's plight but scant attention at that time. There was always before me, day and night, a horrible nightmare of the frightful scenes through which I knew my princess might even then be passing, the horrid plantmen, the ferocious white apes. At times I would cover my face with my hands in a vain effort to shut out the fearful thing from my mind. It was in the forenoon that we arrived above the mile-high scarlet tower which marks Greater Helium from her twin city. As we descended in great circles toward the navy docks, a mighty multitude could be seen surging in the streets beneath. Helium had been notified by radio aerogram of our approach. From the deck of the Xaverian, we four, Carthoris, Tarkas, Xodar, and I, were transferred to a lesser flyer to be transported to quarters within the Temple of Reward. It is here that Martian justice is meted to benefactor or malefactor. Here the hero is decorated. Here the felon is condemned. We were taken into the temple from the landing stage upon the roof, so that we did not pass among the people at all, as is customary. Always before I had seen prisoners of note or returned wanderers of eminence paraded from the gate of Jedex to the Temple of Reward, up the broad avenue of ancestors, through dense crowds of jeering or cheering citizens. I knew that Xodar dared not trust the people near to us, for he feared that their love for Carthoris and myself might break into a demonstration which would wipe out their superstitious horror of the crime we were to be charged with. What his plans were I could only guess, but that they were sinister was evidenced by the fact that only his most trusted servitors accompanied us upon the flyer to the Temple of Reward. We were lodged in a room upon the south side of the temple, overlooking the avenue of ancestors, down which we could see the full length to the gate of Jedex, 5 miles away. The people in the temple plaza and in the streets for a distance of a full mile were standing as close packed as it was possible for them to get. They were very orderly. There were neither scoffs nor plaudits, and when they saw us at the window above them, there were many who buried their faces in their arms and wept. Late in the afternoon a messenger arrived from Xodar to inform us that we would be tried by an impartial body of nobles in the great hall of the temple at the Verse Zod *, on the following day, or at about 8:40 a.m. Earth time. *, wherever Captain Carter has used Martian measurements of time, distance, weight, and the like, I have translated them into as nearly their equivalent in earthly values as is possible. His notes contain many Martian tables and a great volume of scientific data, but since the International Astronomic Society is at present engaged in classifying, investigating, and verifying this vast fund of remarkable and valuable information, I have felt that it will add nothing to the interest of Captain Carter's story or to the sum total of human knowledge to maintain a strict adherence to the original manuscript in these matters, while it might readily confuse the reader and detract from the interest of the history. For those who may be interested, however, I will explain that the Martian day is a trifle over 24 hours 37 minutes duration, Earth time. This the Martians divide into 10 equal parts, commencing the day at about 6 a.m., Earth time. The Zodes are divided into 50 shorter periods, each of which in turn is composed of 200 brief periods of time, about equivalent to the earthly second. The Barsoomian table of time as here given is but a part of the full table appearing in Captain Carter's notes. Table: 200 tals, 1 x, 50 x, 1 zode, 10 zodes, 1 revolution of Mars upon its axis. End of chapter 16.